Panzerschule uses and recommends golden maple brushes. This set is fantastic for wargamers. Not only is there a great choice of brushes for all the different tasks that you will face when completing a range of products, but they're also affordable and very durable. I've been using this set now for over 1,000 hours of painting. You'll see me using the golden maple brushes in my videos, and I also use them in my day-to-day commission painting work. As a full-time painter, the brushes, they've got to be right for me or I'm going to have very poor results, and I use golden maple because they give me really good results. I strongly recommend them, and there is a link in the description below for you to try out this set with a nice discount code for you to give them a try. Welcome back to the channel, folks, and to another painting tutorial. But before I get painting, I just want to show you the project that the subject of this tutorial was part of. Now this, as you can see, is quite a lot of Soviets. I'm going to be showing you today how I painted these sniper teams. Now this was part of a Soviet project, and this is infantry elements. Next up will be the artillery, anti-tank gun elements, and then finally the vehicle elements. Oh, and also some Cossacks. And I will definitely do a painting tutorial when I am doing the Cossacks too, because that's an interesting subject. Maybe not one that's close to your heart in terms of the list you'd like to play, but always good to see. But what you can see here is the submachine gun box set, and then 3 rifle company box sets. Then we have anti-tank rifle teams, a couple of formation HQs, the snipers themselves, and a couple of heavy machine gun units. Now clearly this is not a force which is going to be in your typical 100-point game, but that's not really what the collector I'm painting these for is aiming at. And he's got some large impressive games in mind, and I'm glad to have been able to help him get the Soviet part of his collection kicked off. But let's go over now and have a look at how I painted up with the various types of uniform and camouflage, and the walls as well, how I painted these Soviet sniper teams. The Soviet sniper sets have got some nice variety of sculpts and of uniforms. We've got some that are in camo overalls, and I'll show you how to do them, but I'm going to start with those that are in the standard Soviet infantry uniform with capes. Now here you can see me following my standard approach to painting my Flames of War minis, which is building up from a German camo black brown shade colour and layering up to a final highlight colour. And the intention here is to create the greatest amount of contrast in these really small figures, which really helps them pop on the tabletop and define their shape. I achieve this look in 2 passes. By that I mean I'm going to make an initial layer and then a refining layer. The initial layer, I will just pick out the shape of the figure, so I'll be looking for folds, for instance in the arms, folds in the legs, folds in the back, and so on. The areas that are really going to catch the eye, and the areas that have really probably got the most detail sculpted into them to help us create the shape. It's a little bit like just painting in lines and painting in blocks, but it's important that we're tidy and neat at this point so that we're ready at the next stage to refine everything. Now in the next stage I'm going to switch down to a finer brush, one that's going to allow me to work in finer, closer detail around the shade areas, because what I'm going to do here is fill in where I need the main colour to be, but also cut into the shade so that there's only just enough shade left to give the shape that we need. If we have too much shade, the whole thing's going to look dark and weird, but if we have just the right amount of shade, it's going to pop. Now most of the work is done when we go on to the highlight. We're going to keep that small, thin, well pointed brush and use Iraqi sand and paint little highlight lines, preferably adjacent to the shade line, because in that way we will create the highest degree of contrast. And if we manage the paint on our brush correctly, then the paint will go on in a nice solid line. If it's too wet, it'll kind of just soften across the surface. It won't be high contrast enough. If it's too dry, it will drag across the surface, and if you do that, then you're not going to get the nice neat tidy lines and sharp finish that you're after. Now I'm moving on to the cloak, and I'm using a very bleached green colour here. By that I mean a sort of faded pastel-y kind of colour that looks as though it's maybe been out in the wilds, rather than a very rich saturated colour. This is Panzeresi's Afrika Korps uniform, but once again anything similar will do here, and the choice is yours anyway, folks. You know, as a painter you do have that choice, that creative choice. Same approach again to the standard uniform colour. We're going to map out the shape of the cloak, map out the folds, and then we're going to go in and refine it. It's worthwhile pointing out, when I am building up the layers on a figure, that I've got a balance in mind. Now this is not an absolutely precise measured balance for every single figure. To measure it, it would be impossible, but what I look for is an 80-10-10. By that I mean 80% of the main colour, in this case the Afrika Korps uniform, 10% of the shade, the German Camo black brown, and 10% of the highlight, and we'll go on to that next. So the highlight colour I'm going to use is pastel green. It works great against the background of the Afrika Korps uniform. It's a light colour, but it's not an overly bright colour, and that's the kind of highlight that I like to use. And with a small thin brush, the paint consistency perfect for it to flow off in a well-defined line, and we can make quick results. Most of the work that's required in this process goes into the initial layering colour, the main colour. The highlight can go really quick, and don't overdo the highlights as well, folks, especially when you're working on something such as a cape, which has got a relatively large surface area. Make sure that you've got that 10-10-80 split. 10% highlight, 10% shade, 80% main colour. Now there's going to be a different approach for the camo smocks, the camo overalls, because we're not going to be building up in layers. And the reason we're not going to be building up in layers is because it would be far too complicated and messy looking if we were to do so whilst creating the camo blotches. So we're going to begin by just giving pretty much a all over colour, all over coat of the main colour. I will still be trying to leave some shade colour where I think it's going to end up, for instance right in the deep areas, you know, the definition between the shoulders and the arms and such likes. But we are going to go back in later on and add the shade back in that we are currently obscuring to get the shape and definition that we need. If we try to do that just now, as I said, it would just look too messy. The final result would be too broken. Now I'm using green ochre as my base colour here. You could also, and I have done in this project, just use the old wood colour too, but I wanted a little bit of something different between the tan type of the amoeba camouflage that we're doing here. The green type, I'll also show that shortly, but two different types of tan just for you guys to see something different and just for them to look a little bit different within the group of snipers. We're still going to have to use 2 coats of paint to get the main colour down, folks. We're not going to worry about defining anything in the second coat. We're just going to get a nice solid layer for us to get the camouflage down on top of next. For the green variant of the amoeba camo, in order to create the greatest possible contrast between the camo colour and the main colour of the smock itself, I'm going to be using green grey, which is quite a nice light colour, but it's not too bright. That will allow the subsequent camo blotches to stand out strongly against that lighter background. So I've got a nice opaque layer of the main smock colour. Now we're adding the camo. This is the amoeba style camo, so we have to paint amoeba style shapes. And I'm going to be using German Camo dark green for this. When you're painting any kind of camouflage pattern, you have to plan a little bit in advance. You have to consider where you're putting the blobs or whatever the hell you've got, and if you're putting on enough or if you're putting on too much, because certain camos have got more or less blotches. In this case there's not too many blotches in the amoeba style camo, so think about like 1 or 2 per sleeve or leg, you know, 2 on the back, things like that. Plan it out so it doesn't end up looking like P-dot camo or such likes, which a lot of camo can do if it's overdone. And when you're painting your camo blotches, we're working at a very small scale here. We don't have to be incredibly accurate, but we do have to give some thought and consideration to the actual shape in historical terms so it looks right. So for instance, splinter camo is quite angular. Then you've got Denison smocks, which are very blobby. These guys, they have got a bit of a sort of central core and little bits sort of sticking out, coming out from them. So we're going to apply the brush to the surface in such a way that we're going to have a central blob and then lines coming off with little blobs on the end. So it's painting lines, painting blobs, and keeping things in proportion to the overall figure, and that should keep us straight. On this figure I have used old wood and I'm painting the blotches on with German Camo medium brown. It provides a sufficiently strong contrast against the background colour for those blobs to stand out. For the green ochre base colour I'm going to use flat earth. And just to stress again, whatever choice of colours you end up using for your amoeba camo, and for other types of camo too, it can be quite a challenge across all the nations to get this right, is the contrast between the different colours. If they go onto the tabletop and then just become a bit of a blur, looking too soft for instance, then there's not enough contrast, so a degree of experimentation may be required. Now once I've got those camo blotches down, we're ready to go in and tidy everything up. By that I mean cut in all the shade to get the shape back, you know, the shade that we would normally leave in if we were layering, and also tidy up around belts, other pieces of equipment and such like that may have got a little bit of paint on them, and we need that shade line between them and the main colour once again to help define the shape. And to do that I'm going to go back to German Camo black brown. I'm going to tidy up all the external areas, you know, as I described, you know, like the holster, the wrists, you know, where it meets the sleeves, faces, you know, necks where it meets the camo smocks and such likes. But most of the time and the greatest care is going to be needed in cutting into the shape of the uniform. Where there are folds, for instance, we want a very careful, very well controlled line of that German Camo black brown, very thin, and that will cut the shape back into the uniform that the camo has removed. But if you do it right and keep the lines in the correct proportion, you won't destroy the final look of the camo itself. Cutting the shade back in like this also means that they're going to look the same, going to look as if they're from the same palette, so to speak, as the other non-camoed figures that are in the unit. So that's these guys finished. I'm not going to show you how I paint rifles and all these kind of things. I've covered that in so many videos, folks. But I am next going to show you how I painted the little brick wall sections that come with these figures. Bricks and rubble are a great feature to add to any kind of base, but particularly for snipers and particularly with that Stalingrad theme in our mind. And the colour that I use to start my bricks, sort of base colour, and it might be the colour that some of them remain as I add in other colours to it, is saddle brown. I begin by adding a coat of saddle brown all over. It doesn't have to be a particularly solid coat at this time, one decent coat should do it. Then I go to some sort of mortar colour. In this case I am using, I think, medium grey, but anything similar in that kind of unsaturated sandy kind of range will do fine. Then it's back to saddle brown to tidy everything up and get the nice opaque layer down on top of that initial coat that we applied. So we're going to be leaving the mortar obviously between the bricks, so that's the only bit we really need to be tidy with in this process, otherwise we can just crack on and get the job done. Now you can just leave it at that, or you can think about adding a little bit of variety to the tones of the bricks. Not going completely wild and having some kind of mad spangled pattern, just adding a bit of colours to the saddle brown for a bit more of a patchwork and varied finish that you'll often see in real walls, which is of course our inspiration. So I achieve that by adding yellowish colours to the saddle brown. Here I'm using yellowish rust from Panzer Aces. Anything similar will do, and to be honest there is no right or wrong colour here, as long as it gives you a different type of red brick colour you can pretty much do what you want. And that's us done folks for this tutorial. Hopefully you found it interesting. There's some ideas there for painting basic Soviet infantry uniforms, but also ideas for how to approach amoeba camouflage, which you can also use on your sappers, but also camouflage in general. So thank you for watching. As always, thanks to the subscribers as always, and to you folks that drop into the channel from time to time to see what we're doing. If you would like to know more about golden maple brushes and get a discount, then check the description below. Strongly recommend them, and as I said, I have been using them now for 1,000 hours at least of painting, and they're going strong. So thanks for watching folks. Hopefully see you all on the next one.